Our speaker today for lunch is Jay Lehr, who has contributed so much to so many of the different fields we work on at DDP meetings that it's hard to imagine anyone here doesn't know who he is and what he does. But in any case, Jay Lehr.
I am going to eventually here today present to you a plan which I call addition by subtraction. My goal is to improve environmental protection throughout the United States, and the way I propose to go about it is by eliminating the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. There are 15,000 employees based in Washington, D.C. and in regional offices who do no useful work whatsoever. And I was thrilled. My daughter Tracy is a TV reporter and a weekend anchor, and she was involved in the pipeline break off Santa Barbara and watched went on, and she was able to testify that the volunteers were doing a really good job and things could have been taken care of in a few days, but the federal government had to come in and interfere with the whole thing. And we see that everywhere. And so I am the most competent person on the planet to write a proposal for the elimination of the federal EPA and the development of a committee of the whole of the 50 state agencies, saving the government your tax money, $6.2 billion, and improving environmental protection. I'm the most capable, competent person to do that because I suspect I am the only scientist alive today that played a major role in establishing the Environmental Protection Agency. Thank you. Yes, this is my penance. My penance from 1968 to 1971. So it seems appropriate that somebody who formed EPA and caused such misery wants now to be on hand at the dismissal of it. And so I will tell you the whole history of it and the plan that has taken me 2 years to devise. And I'll tell you the good news at the very beginning that Scott Walker has already adopted my entire plan that you're going to hear for his platform running for the Republican nomination. While I do not think he'll get the nomination, and I think whoever gets the nomination likely won't win, because my daughter Tracy wants a woman president, and I think that will go a long way. So regardless of how revolting Hillary is, I suspect she'll be our next president, but that's the way it goes. But my plan will be discussed, I think, and hopefully when Scott Walker starts talking about it, others will as well. And so my goal just deals with the Environmental Protection Agency, and I will tell you the whole story, and I will get you out of here on time. I always bring my own wristwatch with me, so I'm never late, and that really works out well. But before I get into the Environmental Protection Agency and my plan, and by the way, you will all have the plan in your email sometime next week. EPA, the Heartland Institute, for whom I'm science director, was so excited about it, they put it into a booklet, sent out 30,000 copies. Every elected official in America has gotten one, and they failed to get them here to hand out. So we will send you an electronic copy, and I hope you'll pass it around. But before I do, I want to kind of set up why we need to do this and look back at the beginnings of our nation. So I'll start by quoting Samuel Adams, writing on January 20th, 1772, in the Boston Gazette. Mr. Adams said, "If the public are bound to yield to obedience to the laws to which they cannot give their approval. They are slaves to those who make such laws and enforce them. And of course, they were talking about England, and this was pre-revolution and pre-constitution. That has become the case in our country, not just EPA, many other agencies that have non-elected officials that make regulation after regulation. What we have in this country is an over-criminalization where the country makes up rules as they go along, and you all break rules. I'm going to guess there's no one in this room that doesn't break the law at least once a week, laws that you do not know exist. There are right now in the federal regulatory handbook 200 volumes of 80,000 laws. Worse than that, there are now 300,000 regulations written by various agencies, with EPA being number one in passing regulations that are not written into law, that do not really create anything bad, and yet they're doing it. 300,000 now, and there'll be more. There'll be more next year. Now, James Madison, our fourth president, wrote about this as well in the Federalist Papers. For those of you not familiar, the Federalist Papers are 85 essays that were written before the vote on the Constitution in an effort to explain what the Constitution was trying to accomplish, in hopes that all the states would go along and accept the Constitution. So in the 62nd of the Federalist essays, James Madison wrote the following: "It will be of little avail to the people that the laws are made by men of their own choosing, if the laws are so voluminous that they cannot be read, or so incoherent that they cannot be understood." That was written in 1787. And that's what we are subject to today. More laws than we can keep track of. And the problem is big business and big government and big special interests collude to pass laws which give them the advantage over their competitors, so there is not competition. So they become richer and they climb the ladder of success, and then they pull that ladder up so that what should be their competitors don't get a fair shake. So we have a warped economy where the rich get richer and the rest of the people have very limited opportunity. So that big business spends more money gaining political influence. Big government gives privilege. So big business, instead of investing in innovation, really is investing in influence. I'll give you some examples. You're all aware that in 2008, the incandescent light bulb was made illegal. That was done by the big light bulb companies because small companies were not capable of making the compact fluorescent light that you have learned to know and hate. They're difficult to read by. They last almost precisely half as long as they're supposed to last. The reason being, because the government, when they tested the CFLs, they simply turned on a few bulbs and waited until they went out. Is that the way you use your light bulbs? No, you turn them on and off, so they last half as long. Well, who do you think developed light-emitting diodes? It wasn't big electric light bulb manufacturers, it was small business. And now the CFL will eventually go away and everybody will be using LEDs. In fact, small business has produced the vast majority of all of our new jobs over the last 15 years. They're the innovators. They're the ones that hire people. Another example are the toy manufacturers. Years ago, you just, went and bought a toy. Now there are laws requiring all kinds of testing of every kind of toy, and of course you get statistics of the child that was injured by a toy. The statistics are all terribly skewed. And who do you think promoted laws to test toys? The big toy companies. Who were the biggest supporters of Obamacare? The big pharmaceutical companies. We call this regulatory capture. If you're big business, you want a regulation that works for you and does not work for your competitors. Today, 1 in 3 individuals is in a profession whereby they need to get approval from the federal government to make a living. I'm not talking about lawyers and doctors. I'm talking about hair braiders, massage therapists. Would you believe there are states that license fortune tellers? I kid you not. The situation is ridiculous. EPA has a lot to do with it. So let me go back, and before I do, I want to promote a good friend's book. Some of you may be familiar with the name Alan Carlin. Alan has a degree in physics from Caltech and economics from MIT. He worked with the Sierra Club for many years before joining EPA in 1976. He worked there for 38 years, but in the last years, he started looking around and realizing there wasn't any science being done at EPA. And so he wrote a massive paper on climate change, putting the lie to absolutely everything that EPA was putting out, very much like the film you saw this morning, the questioning of the former administrator of EPA by one of our Congress people. Well, for having done that, they put a gag order on him and did not allow him to write anything about climate change or anything about science. They basically locked him up in his office. Finally, after 38 years, he resigned. Now, what I want to tell you, raise your hand if you know Alan Carlin. Okay. Would you disagree with me that if you spent 10 minutes with him, you might think that he was the model for the old comic strip Casper Milquetoast? I mean, anything, Willie gets up there and screaming and yelling and a lot of energy. Alan Carlin is just the quietest guy you ever want to meet. Talks softly. But he sat down and sadly, in 600 pages, tells the entire story of EPA. It's called Environmentalism Gone Mad. It's really 3 books, and I just reviewed it for one of Heartland's publications. If you're a reader and you can invest 20 hours, it's awesome. It's first a memoir of his life, the first 138 pages, and then opinions on the government, journalism, politicians, and where they all go wrong, and then a major section on what science really is, which you've heard a lot of already this morning. I strongly recommend it. All right, let's go back to the beginning. 1968. I am the head of a professional society of groundwater hydrologists, and I get a call from Jim McDermott, the director of the Office of Water Hygiene in the Department of Health. And he said he's getting a committee together of the heads of the major professional societies that deal with the environment. And would I come to Washington and meet with a half a dozen people and hear his plan to establish an environmental protection agency. He wanted to raise up what he was doing at the Bureau of Hygiene into a cabinet agency that would get attention. We met in Washington. We all thought it was a great idea because we all knew there were major environmental problems. Right around that time, in Cleveland, Ohio, did what? Caught on fire. We all knew industries that were dumping their garbage in the nearest stream or river, midnight dumpers, we call them. We knew the government didn't know the difference between groundwater and surface water. So we thought it was a really good idea. And the 6 of us worked very hard for the next 4 years, 80, 68, 69, 70, and 71. I went myself before Congress on 36 occasions, Senate and House, to explain what our environmental problems were and why we needed an Environmental Protection Agency. And in November of 1971, after we orchestrated a cancer scare on the Mississippi River going down to New Orleans, and that was, I'm not proud of that. I didn't blow the whistle on it, but there was data that the cancer rate in New Orleans was exceptionally high because they were drinking the Mississippi River water and there were problems. And I would say we just kind of, we didn't form the story, we weren't responsible for it, we didn't intercede. I feel bad about that now. I look the other way then. In any case, in November 1971, President Nixon signed the legislation to form the Environmental Protection Agency. For the next 10 years, I worked on various committees for EPA to write legislation. And we set out for 10 years to create a safety net for our environment. In those 10 years, I helped to write 7 pieces of legislation and avoided the 8th. We had one law. It was the Water Pollution Control Act. We revised it. It was originally passed in 1945. It was amended once after that, but we redid that and turned it into the Clean Water Act. Then we wrote the Safe Drinking Water Act. Then we did a waste disposal act called the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. Then we looked at agriculture and we wrote a fungicide, insecticide, what else? FIFRA. What's the other F? Herbicide, rodenticide. We wrote that act. And then we wrote a bill for surface mining, which was so clever that it also included deep mining, even though the bill was called the Surface Mining Reclamation and Control Act. And then we wrote a Clean Air Act. Altogether, I may not have mentioned all 7, but you'll see it when you get the paper. 7 pieces of legislation. And I would sit in the bowels of an executive office building with a guy who spoke legalese. And I would, tell him what I thought we needed to do, as did the rest of the people on my committee. And they would write laws and they were passed. And they were really good. The 8th law, which I had no part in because I was smart enough to know it made no sense, was the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Law, which which you know as what? Superfund. Some clever journalist named it Superfund. And it was a terrible law. It was 87 pages long. And it was a terrible law because it made criminals of businesses that had done everything legal in getting rid of their waste. So they changed the law of how you get rid of waste and then went backwards and said, I don't care if you dispose of your waste legally, you have now broken the law. And it bankrupted hundreds of companies. It went on for about 15 years. It spawned an industry of environmental remediation. So that was the only law that I was involved in peripherally, because I was still working as an advisor at EPA, that didn't work out. All right, so now we had a safety net. Now, who was going to implement these laws? The states. But they did not have the capacity at that time. Some states didn't have an environmental protection organization. Many did. But they all had to beef up and get ready to take over the responsibility of these laws. And it was called primacy. Each state had to fill out forms, be reviewed, be inspected, and prove that they were capable, and it had to be one law at a time. They had to take on primacy of each of these environmental protection laws. During that 10-year period, while that was going on, the federal government had to do the job. So we established a research arm of organizations that actually existed to some extent under other aegis, and of course set up offices in Washington, and it grew and grew. By the end of that decade, by 1980, all of the states had taken over primacy. All of the states were implementing all 7 of the safety net laws, and it was when Superfund, CERCLA, was going through that the environmental zealot organizations realized that EPA was the best machinery for them to see their goals carried out. And from 1981 on, over the next 15 years, I would say, US EPA became truly a wholly owned subsidiary of the green movement. They supplied most of the employees. When people left EPA, they went into these various NGOs, non-government organizations that were as green as green can be. Now, I'm now going to make a statement to you that I hope some of you will do some research and try to challenge me. You'll fail, but I would love it if you would try. And the statement is, since 1980, every one of those safety net laws that I mentioned, the water, the air, the waste disposal, the chemicals, the mining, and so on, every one of those laws has been amended to become stronger. And not one of those amendments has improved environmental quality or improved the health of our society. So everything that has happened in the last 35 years with regard to environmental protection has been to reduce our economic capacity, make no contribution to our health, and enable, however, or enable in the minds of EPA to write more and more new regulations that were never written into law. We really have very few environmental regulations that are by statute, that are actually written into the law that the Congress passed. But EPA reads the law and says, well, we think this law gives us the jurisdiction to pass this regulation or that regulation. And as a result, EPA has grown to be, in my mind, an ugly, evil behemoth that does this nation no good whatsoever. Therefore, a change needs to be made. Since I was there at the beginning, and I'm not sure anybody I was very young. I was only 32. I'd say everyone else I worked with was 45 and older, so I can't say that I've traced whether they're alive or dead, but they're certainly not active. But I felt like it fell to me a couple of years ago to undo the harm I did. Now, I really don't feel I did harm. We absolutely needed an environmental protection agency. We needed to have some rules and regulations to protect our environment. There are people that will argue that point with me, saying that just the natural scheme of things, everything would have been better. But be that as it may, I took it on myself to write this plan to phase out US EPA over a 5-year period and replace it with a committee of the whole of the 50 state agencies. Now, if you read the Constitution, as I have done, it's quite clear that's what the Founding Fathers intended. They did not intend to have a gigantic federal government. They really were very few things that they felt the government should totally be in charge of. A court system, an army, a road system, and most everything that's happened was not intended by the Founding Fathers. And so my plan to turn back the agency to a committee of the whole, the 50 state agencies, is reasonable in keeping with what the Founding Fathers wanted. I was giving a talk in Washington a couple months ago with Senator Inhofe, who is the head of the Senate Environment Committee. And he spoke before me, and I was going to present my plan. And I had an idea that, being as busy as he was, he might scoot out of the conference before I got to talk, which was probably 45 minutes down the road. So when he asked some questions, I raised my hand, and my question was, Senator Inhofe, are you going to be here when I speak in 45 minutes? He said, no, I got another meeting to go to. And I said, gee, that's a shame, because I want to present you with a plan to phase out EPA. I was involved in helping to start it, and now I'd like to end it, and I've written this plan. I stopped talking. He paused for a moment, and he said, he knew me, he said, Jay, if you think writing some little paper pamphlet about phasing out EPA will ever make up for the crime you committed in starting EPA, and as you did, the audience fell out of their seats laughing. And you know, maybe he's right. All right, here is the plan, and I've spent a couple of years on this. It doesn't have any downsides, and it's been fun talking to Scott Walker's office, filling in the holes and answering questions, and they haven't had any problem with the answers. Here's the plan. First, I got to tell you about EPA. Let me tell you again, 15,000 employees, mostly in Washington, D.C., and some in 10 regional centers. The EPA is divided up into 14 offices, each of which has their own budget. Of the 14 offices, only 4 deal with the environment. There's an air office, a water office, a solid waste office, and a chemical contamination office. The other offices are finance, policy, 2 administration offices, information. There is a research office, although they don't do any research in Washington. But the most shocking thing is there's an Office of Indian Affairs and an Office of Indian Environment. Have you ever heard of the Bureau of Indian Affairs? Don't you think they should be in charge? 14 offices. So the plan is that you go into Washington in the first year, you tell everybody that in 5 years, everybody will be gone. But this year, you can just look for another job. And then we lay out which of the 14 offices get moved to another location where the Committee of the Whole will be, which I'll explain in a moment. But in the first year, the 2 Indian Affairs offices, Indian Environment and Indian Affairs, will move to the Bureau of Indian Affairs with half of the budget. And I'm sure BIA will be thrilled to get the money and the responsibility. In fact, I'm sure they have been annoyed for years that there are responsibilities for the Indians that they don't carry. So no one would lose their job in the first year. Now, in that first year, we set up an office of the Committee of the Whole. I have chosen Topeka, Kansas, not because I own any real estate there at all, but because it's in the center of the country, and it reduces travel from the 50 states into Topeka. Each state would contribute 6 employees to the Committee of the Whole that would be moved from their states to Topeka. Offices would be built there. The 300 employees would be divided up into subcommittees of air, water, chemical pollution, and solid waste, and so on. And in that first year, they would spend a lot of time traveling and visiting Washington to see what goes on there, to see if they're capable of carrying it on. And they'd visit the regional offices, which reminds me of a very true story. I have a classmate at Princeton by the name of Carl Icahn. You've probably seen him in the news. He's a big financial wheeler and dealer. And he told me one day, about only 2 or 3 years ago, about a company he was going to buy that made railroad cars. And the company had 800 employees in New York City on 4 floors of an office building. And they had 100 executive people in Chicago, Illinois. Well, he said whenever he's looking at a company, he takes out a yellow legal pad and he walks around and he studies what people are doing. And he spent a few days going through the office and trying to see what the 800 people on four floors were doing. And he came up pretty much empty-handed, couldn't figure it out. So he called the bosses in Chicago and he said, you know, I've been looking at New York. It doesn't look like it's really worthwhile. And he asked this question of the boss in Chicago. He said, if I closed the New York office and I laid off the 800 people, how many people would you have to add to your 100 people in Chicago? And he heard a pause. And the fellow said, add? No, I'd be able to let go of 20 people whose sole job is to look after the 400 people, the 800 people in New York. Addition by subtraction. So the first year we've set up in Topeka or maybe some other town. And we've looked over everything that was going on. We told everybody that 25% of them would lose their jobs in the second year, another 25 in the third year, another 25 in the fourth year, and the final 25 in the fifth year. And the first offices to be moved to Topeka in the second year would be the offices that have names like they ensure enforcement. There's an enforcement office. There's a policy office. There's the finance office would stay. The information office would stay. But there are about 4 offices that could be moved right away, and probably in the end disbanded because the committee of the whole would just naturally handle things for themselves. The second year, the air and water would move to Topeka. The third year would be chemical and waste disposal. The fourth year would be information and legal. And the fifth year would be the administrative offices. Now, my guess is that it would, over this 5-year period where we're goring nobody's ox, we don't want to harm anybody or put them out of work, that there would be time for many people, to jump ship, and the actual transition will take less time for some offices because there may not be enough employees left to do what they were doing. So obviously, there would be flexible changes in the plan over the years. But at the end of 5 years, there'd be no one in Washington, no one in the regional offices. The research office itself would be gone, but there are about a dozen research centers around the United States that do actual research on environmental issues. And they would stay intact until the committee of the whole of the 50 states, decides maybe to, certainly take charge of what research they did, maybe disband some of the facilities, maybe enlarge other facilities, but that would, by and large, be the only office that would maintain intact, but not in Washington, D.C. Now, the most important part of what is then going to go on, and it will start literally in year 1, it'll continue through the 5-year phase out, and likely another 5 years beyond. And that is for the committee of the whole to analyze every single regulation that EPA has promulgated, whether by statute from the Congress or just writing things by fiat. An example of 2 of those that you read about daily. One is the waters of the United States. You read in the newspaper WOTUS, W-O-T-U-S. And that regulation, which they're trying to pass, says that but I'm serious, any puddle on your land, which may drain into a well, no longer can do anything with that puddle without our approval. That is the law. I'm not exaggerating. I'm not making a cartoon. Now, I live in the woods with a backyard that floods if it rains a lot. And as the rain stops, the water runs off the backyard into a creek behind our house. We clearly would not be allowed to do anything in our backyard without approval from the federal government. Domestic commercial, that's one of the regulations. Another, of course, is the coal emissions. We talked about the mercury emissions this morning. Certainly the air emissions, the PM 2.5. The Committee of the Whole would look at 2 sets of regulations, and it would likely take 10 years. And if it was a regulation we call by fiat, not backed up by written legislation, written clearly in the law, the committee would have the right to vote with a 2/3 majority to eliminate the regulation altogether, maintain the regulation, or a third option would be to make it up to the state whether they want to implement it or not. The rules that are promulgated from legislation written clearly into law, they would be considered, and if the Committee of the Whole feels that they need tweaking or changing, eliminating, whatever, they would send a memo to Congress to take a look at this law and perhaps send recommendations as to what should be done. It'll take 10 years, clearly, because we're talking about tens of thousands of regulations, most of which you have never heard of, but which hamstring the American economy. Now, clearly, everybody who's a deep green, an environmental zealot, everybody who really opposes capitalism and doesn't want our country to prosper economically will be opposed to the plan. But they're quite a minority. There's hardly anybody working for a business or in a business in this nation whose life is made less prosperous, whose life isn't made less prosperous. So the overwhelming support of the plan among the public, I think, will be huge, and that is what Scott Walker says, and that's why he wants to have it. Now, what about the money? We start with a budget of $8.2 billion. As the different offices and responsibilities are transferred to the new office of the Committee of the Whole, there would be money available no longer spent. And over the 5-year period, the budget will be reduced dramatically, in fact, down to $2 billion. Well, how are we going to spend $2 billion now, going from 15,000 employees to 300 employees? Well, we're going to immediately spend $1 billion by giving each of the 50 states a $20 million grant, an annual grant of $20 million to help them do their job better, to replace the 6 people that they're contributing to the new central office. Quizzed people all over the country about it in state agencies. And we've not found many, save the state of California, that is not the idea. Who among you work better with useless people looking over your shoulder, being in charge of you? Who among you? Nobody. Nobody. When I say this is a plan to improve environmental protection, I am dead serious. Every state agency, without the watchdog folks in Washington, and with the additional $20 million in their budget, will do a far better job. Everybody knows the best government is your local government. The closer government is to you, the better it understands all of your problems. Now, here's proof that environmental protection will not suffer. I'm going to take a wild guess that there are only a handful of people in this room who love their state environmental protection agency. Most their environmental protection agency think they're overbearing. They all think they're too hard to live with. My point being, it's not like we're giving the hen house watch job to a fox. It's not that at all. We have absolutely people in the state agencies who are just hell-bent to protect their citizens' air, water, and soil, whether they like it or not. So nobody's going to get a pass. The environmental protection will improve. In the end, you'll save $6.2 billion. The other billion I didn't mention will be the cost of building an office, setting things up in Topeka, travel for the state people in and out. It's just a general number. It might be a little bit less than that, but nobody has argued that without the 15,000 people, we'll save $6.2 billion. Now, there's the plan. I've done 40 radio shows and 12 television shows talking about it in the last year. And with no exceptions, the first question that comes to me after I explain the plan or they know about it and ask me some questions, the first comment they make is, well, couldn't this plan be used to get rid of the Department of Education, IRS, you know? And indeed it can. You know, I'm only expert in the area of the environment, so I certainly would have no competence to deal with any other agency and figure out how to disband it, but other people smarter than I will have that ability. So there's not only a chance that we can succeed, there's a chance that we'll be starting something big. This kind of dovetails at Heartland, and you all have my card on the table for a couple of reasons. One, Heartland has a new address. We have we've been in downtown Chicago for 30 years, and we just bought our own offices in a suburb of Chicago, Arlington Heights, so you have our new address. We're having our grand opening on the 20th and 21st of August. You also have my email address. You have the office telephone number of the 312 area code. The other number shown as my cell phone number is incorrect. It actually was the landline in my house, and we got rid of our landline, and Heartland did not put in my new cell phone number, so ignore that one, but my email is correct. And after you get the plan and read it, if you have any questions, feel free to email me. I have 14 minutes left for questions, which was my plan, so I'm going to start. Yes?
Is this an enforcement agency, and if so, who are the enforcers?
No, it's definitely, and the enforcement is done by the states. I mean, there are legal wording that has to be worked out, but it is basically a policy statement to reestablish all of the programs for the nation to be carried out by the states. The first, you said the word I couldn't find a while back. The first office of EPA to move will be the enforcement agency because there's no need for it. There's no need for enforcement. Yes?
The New Zealanders did this, and their great insight was that if you phase it in over 5 years, it never happened. The whole idea of a phase-in reflects your long marination in Washington, and should be rejected. If you're going to do it, you got to do it.
Well, all right. George, I appreciate your insight, and clearly you know more about these kind of things than I do, but I disagree, because to cut it off and get rid of it is simply a non-starter. I have been able to talk to people everywhere and really didn't get a lot of pushback. And again, if Scott Walker starts talking about it, you know, hopefully at his debate on next week, but certainly in his stump speeches, I think it is reasonable. Yes?
you talked to any other candidates, and if so, what has been their response?
We have not talked to any other candidates. We will. I mean, clearly we will. Our hope is that Scott will begin talking about it, and it will spread of its own. However, we've sent the brochure to every elected official. I don't know, who reads these kind of things. I hope you'll read it when you get it. It's only a 15 or 20-minute read. It's fairly simple. We have now employed a couple lawyers in Washington to look at, any, problems in the language and try to make it more legislative ready. But certainly our goal is to get it to everybody. But we didn't sell it to Scott Walker. I mean, he came through voluntarily and adopted it hook, line, and sinker. I spent 3 hours last week with their office, a lot of questions to ask, and I had a lot of answers to give. It really helps when you're dealing with someone who was there from the beginning in the first 10 years. I mean, there really aren't many answers that I don't have. Yes?
Is the primary purpose to save money at the federal level or to ease regulation? Because, if they have extra money, they always find other places to spend it.
No. The primary purpose is definitely not to save money. That's just a lovely side effect. The primary purpose is to take the yoke off the American people that are being strangled by useless regulations.
And are they going to rechannel it through the state agencies? Because just like in California. No, I mean, they wouldn't, our goal was to give them $20 million, take 6 of their employees, and obviously we have no control over that. But no, the idea is to save the taxpayer $6.2 billion. That's not the primary focus, it's just what works out. Yes, Fred. Fred Singer, has everyone seen Fred here this week?
A modest contribution to your general aim, which I strongly support. I joined the EPA as a Deputy Assistant Administrator on December 1, 1970, when it was established. I lasted exactly 6 months. I think the next president, whoever he might be, needs to appoint an administrator with lots of guts, who is not an empire builder. And then the administrator has to do a very simple thing. He has to establish an office in Alaska, preferably northern Alaska, near the wildlife, so-called wildlife refuge, and transfer 15,000 people to that office. Eliminate a good many EPA employees.
I think it's a good alternate plan, Fred. Okay.
These things do happen. They have children in school, and so they can't leave their families behind in Virginia or wherever. So they will resign from EPA, and EPA will suddenly emerge with only a few hundred people.
Yeah. Well, that's an alternate plan to George Gilder's, definitely. That would work the same way, George. Yeah.
Bureaucracy often works if you know how to handle it.
I couldn't agree more. There are alternates. Now, along this line, Heartland has taken on a new program for the coming years that we've never had before. We are going to spend a good deal of our energy and money working toward a constitutional convention. Many people think that would be insane and crazy. However, in the Constitution, there is a code letter number that I have forgotten, whereby you can call a convention which limits the subjects that can come up before the delegates of the 50 states. And of course, you've got to get 36 or 37 states to go along. But we are going to work toward a constitutional convention along with trying to get rid of EPA. The government is broken. EPA cannot be fixed. I mean, don't even think about fixing it. It has to be eliminated. I think that's true of a few other agencies. Virtually 100% of the people that work there have now come out of the green organizations. When they leave, they go back. It would be impossible to fix it. It absolutely has to be eliminated. And while I would love to adopt George Gilder's plan and just get rid of it in one fell swoop, We don't think that's politically possible. Next question.
It's what New Zealand did was rescind all the laws. You can't go back and check each one and have each one haggled over. You've got to have a jubilee.
Well, all right, okay. But New Zealand has 14 million people. We have 330 million. And I know, Maurice Teague is one of my favorite people, and what they did in New Zealand is awesome. But it doesn't really scale up from 14 million to 330 million. But that's my opinion. Yes?
What safeguards are we going to put in place to prevent this new 50-state committee to grow like an octopus?
Right. I've been asked that question before, and I have no answer whatsoever. But forewarned is forearmed, but it's a very good question. Yes, Steve?
There is a safeguard, and that's the Federalist system. And the states have to compete. And if the states are implementing the environmental laws, if any of them get way out of whack, businesses and people are going to move to other states. So the break on that, I think, is the Federalist system.
Yes, all the way back.
I would commend you for your repentance for your deeds. However, if what you're describing is a committee that is still under federal control, it sounds like we're just changing the face of this whole thing. And again, I would say that an immediate discontinuation of all of this is essential if it's going to succeed.
It would definitely not be under federal control.
Now, there is no constitutional provision for the EPA, for medical care, for education, for all of these things. So a committee of this sort is really inappropriate. Each state should have its own entity.
And they do. They do have their own entities. All they would be doing is agreeing to work together on what is so important that it should be done by everybody and what is not so important that it should be done by everybody.
But it doesn't have to be copied by another state. Each state could have its own.
Well, as I told you, they would go, the plan is over 10 years they'd go through every single regulation. And they would vote, by the way, the 300 would vote for their chairman with a 3-year term is one of the things I put in there. But they would, the group would decide whether it's so important the whole nation should have it, or it probably should be dismissed, or it should be under the jurisdiction of the state. So we really have covered that. Clearly there are wrinkles to be worked out, and hopefully when it's totally put into legislative jargon, we'll cover those things.
I would suggest that if you truly want to do penance, eliminate the thing altogether, no money going back to the states. After all, the states are the ones that are sending the money in the first place.
True.
No money going back to the states. Save all of that 62.2.
There are many alternate plans, but this one is working. You had a question first.
Echoing what George Gilder said about all the existing regulations, you want to spend 10 years going through them line by line. You also described that each one of them has to get a 2/3 vote to fit into one of 3 slots.
Right.
Okay. Why don't we just wipe the slate clean? Those laws that they feel are so urgent that those regulations that have to be put back in place, they can, in 6 weeks, they can put those back in place by a 2/3 vote of the committee of the whole. But don't drag this.
Now that would be an option. That would be an option of the committee of the whole to do exactly as you say, Howard. Yeah.
I'd like to suggest that this committee of the whole have no power, because really what you're suggesting is that the states get together. If they get together, if it's such a damn good idea, you won't have to force it.
That could happen, yes.
Who appoints the 6 representatives? Because in the end, you can have the cure can be worse than the disease.
Each state would appoint their 6 people.
Political, who appoints those?
The administrator of each individual state would choose the 6 people.
Same forces that now.
I don't think so. I've worked with a couple dozen state EPAs, and as much as they may be overbearing,
I find them generally honorable neighbors of the people. So I don't. No, I said, remember, I mentioned California is probably will be one of the states that won't want this plan because they don't want to be ruled by the other 49. Minute and a half. One last question? Right there.
Under this commission, does the federal proposed rulemaking provisions have to apply to change what is now existing law? How do you go about administering?
Well, I covered that. The regulations, which we say are done by fiat, they're just out of thin air where the agency thinks that a particular piece of legislation gives them the power. They can just be eliminated, requiring no legislation at all. If the rule clearly is written into one of our environmental laws, then it has to go back to the Congress. No question about it. Good point, N. Thank you all very much.